The engine of the semi-truck rumbled like a beast, its massive frame blocking my entire Lakeside driveway. I stood frozen on my porch, my fists clenched as I stared at the ridiculous sight before me. A whole 18-wheeler parked right at my property line, making it impossible for me to drive out. My stomach twisted in rage. The HOA had gone too far this time. I had put up with their nonsense for months, petty fines, letters about my grass being too long, even threats over my choice of mailbox color. But this was an all-out attack. I stormed toward the truck, my breath coming out fast. I didn't even notice the black SUV parked down the street, or the man in a suit watching me from behind tinted windows. A voice came from the truck's cabin. "You're not going anywhere, Mr. Lawson," the driver said, grinning as he leaned out. HOA orders. I opened my mouth to curse him out, but before I could, sirens filled the air. The black SUV's doors burst open. Armed agents in black jackets with bright yellow letters, FBI, jumped out. "Hands where we can see them," one of them yelled. My heart pounded. The truck driver's face went pale. What the hell was happening? 3 days earlier, I had no idea my life was about to turn into a nightmare. It all started when I got yet another letter from the HOA. It was their usual nonsense, some ridiculous complaint about the color of my outdoor security cameras. Apparently, black cameras didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. I sighed and tossed the letter onto my kitchen counter. "This is getting stupid," I muttered. I had moved to this lakeside neighborhood for peace and quiet. I wanted to enjoy my boat, go fishing, and sip coffee on my deck in the mornings. But the HOA had turned my dream into a constant battle. At first, it was small things. Warnings about my trash cans being visible from the street. A fine for my grass being half an inch too tall. But then things got weird. I started getting letters that didn't make sense. One said I had to paint my fence white, but I didn't have a fence. Another said my Christmas lights were still up in April, even though I never put any up. It was like someone was messing with me on purpose. And then came the visits. A man in a cheap HOA badge knocked on my door one evening. "We noticed you installed security cameras," he said, forcing a smile. "That's against our community guidelines." I frowned. "There's nothing in the rules about cameras." He chuckled, shaking his head. "We make the rules as we go." That should have been my first red flag. The next day, my mailbox was ripped out of the ground. A letter arrived saying my driveway needed to be inspected. When I refused to let them dig up my property, I got a $2,000 fine. By the end of the week, I was ready to fight back. That's when I decided to dig into the HOA itself. I started looking up the names of the board members. Something fell off. The HOA fees were high, but where was the money going? I asked around the neighborhood, but my neighbors seemed nervous to talk. "Just let it go," one of them whispered. Another told me, "You don't want to make them mad." That night, I sat in my garage with my laptop, digging deeper into who was really running this HOA. And what I found chilled me to the bone. The HOA president, Mark Luton, wasn't just some neighborhood busybody. He had ties to multiple shell companies. Huge amounts of money were being funneled through the HOA's accounts, way more than simple fees should cover. It looked like they were laundering money. And that wasn't even the worst part. A few names kept popping up alongside Luton's. Names that didn't belong to suburban HOA members. Names that belonged to criminals. My hands felt clammy as I clicked on one link after another. Drug trafficking, property scams, bribery. I swallowed hard. I had just stumbled into something dangerous. I thought about calling the police, but something told me they already knew. This was bigger than a few fines and a ripped-out mailbox. Then, my security cameras caught movement outside. A black SUV parked just down the street. I felt my stomach drop. The next morning, I woke up to find a semi-truck parked across my driveway. And now, standing here with FBI agents surrounding me, I knew this was no longer about HOA rules. Something much bigger was happening, and I was right in the middle of it. The scene in front of me was pure chaos. FBI agents swarmed the semi-truck, weapons drawn. The truck driver, who had been all cocky just a minute ago, was now frozen in place, his hands shaking as he slowly raised them. I barely had time to process what was happening before one of the agents turned toward me. "Mr. Lawson, step back," he barked. I took a slow step away, my hands instinctively rising. What is this?" I stammered. I thought this was just HOA nonsense. The agent closest to me, a tall man in a black tactical vest, gave me a sharp look. Not anymore. Then suddenly, bang, a loud gunshot echoed through the air. I ducked. My heart slammed against my chest. The shot had come from inside the truck. The agents reacted instantly. "Shots fired," one of them shouted. Another shot rang out, and I scrambled backward, nearly falling. The driver of the truck looked just as terrified as me. "I swear, I don't know anything," he yelled, his hand still up. "I was just told to park here." But the agents weren't looking at him anymore. Their guns were now aimed at the back of the truck. Someone was inside. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. One of the agents motioned to another, and within seconds, they were moving toward the truck's massive cargo doors. "On my count," one of them said. 3, 2, 1. They yanked the doors open. For a second, everything went dead silent. Then I saw it. A man tied up, his face covered in bruises, his wrists and ankles bound with thick rope. His eyes were wild, darting around as if he wasn't sure if he was being saved or thrown into a deeper nightmare. "What the hell?" I breathed. One of the FBI agents immediately climbed into the truck, checking the man's pulse. "He's alive. Who is he?" I asked, my voice shaking. One of the agents, the one who seemed in charge, finally turned to me. His face was serious. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Mr. Lawson." And just like that, I knew my quiet Lakeside life was officially over. The morning had started out normal. Well, as normal as things got these days. After uncovering the shady HOA money trail the night before, I barely got any sleep. My brain wouldn't stop racing. I kept checking my security cameras, watching that black SUV parked at the end of my street. Who was inside? Were they watching me? By sunrise, I had decided to take a drive, just to clear my head. That's when I found the semi-truck blocking my driveway. At first, I thought it was a prank, a final act of pettiness from the HOA. But as I stood there, staring up at the truck, something about it felt off. For one, the truck was running. Its engine was still humming. And when I walked around the side, I noticed the back doors were locked shut, not with a regular padlock, but with a thick chain and a reinforced steel latch. Something about it sent chills down my spine. I took a deep breath and knocked on the driver's side door. "Hey, move your truck." Nothing. I knocked harder. I said move. That's when the window rolled down and the driver, a man I had never seen before, gave me that smug grin. "Not happening, buddy." The way he said it, it was almost like a joke. Like he knew something I didn't. I had no idea that within minutes, FBI agents would be storming my property. That I would be standing in front of a kidnapped man, tied up in a truck. That my whole life was about to be turned upside down. Back in the present, the FBI agents were working fast. The kidnapped man was rushed out of the truck. Paramedics appeared out of nowhere, loading him onto a stretcher. He was too weak to talk, but his eyes, they were filled with fear. I turned to the FBI agent in charge. "What is going on?" He studied me for a long second, then sighed. "You're in the middle of something bigger than you realize, Lawson." I shook my head. "This is about the HOA, isn't it?" The agent's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away, but then he said something that made my blood run cold. "We've been investigating your HOA for over a year." I felt like the ground was tilting beneath me. Investigating them? For what? The agent exhaled sharply. "Money laundering, organized crime, human trafficking." My stomach dropped. "You mean?" I pointed at the man who had been tied up in the truck. The agent nodded. "He's not the first one we've found." I felt sick. All this time, I thought the HOA was just a bunch of power-hungry busybodies with nothing better to do. But this was next-level evil. I turned back toward my house, my mind racing. Had they been watching me? Was I in danger? Before I could ask another question, the FBI agent grabbed my arm. "You need to come with us, Mr. Lawson." My pulse spiked. What? What? The agent looked me right in the eyes. "Because after what just happened, the HOA is going to come for you next." I stared at the FBI agent, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear over the rush of blood in my ears. "The HOA is going to come for me." I repeated, my voice shaking. "You mean like kill me?" The agent didn't answer immediately. He just gave me a hard look and said, "Get in the SUV. Now." I glanced back at my house. My safe house. My little lakeside retreat that I had poured my savings into. And now, because of some corrupt HOA, I was being forced to leave it behind. But what choice did I have? I took a deep breath and climbed into the back of the black SUV. The agent slammed the door behind me, and the vehicle peeled away from my driveway, leaving the chaos of the semi-truck, flashing police lights, and stunned neighbors behind. I turned to the agent. "At least tell me your name." "Agent Miller," he said, eyes focused on the road ahead. "Okay, Agent Miller, mind explaining why the HOA of my quiet neighborhood is involved in human trafficking?" He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "It didn't start that way," he admitted. "Your HOA was originally just another corrupt organization skimming money off homeowners. Fines, bogus violations, easy ways to take people's cash." I clenched my jaw. "Yeah, I noticed." "But then," Miller continued, "they got greedy. They started using the HOA as a front to launder money, to move illegal goods, and eventually people." I felt nauseous. "People?" He nodded grimly. "We've been tracking them for over a year, but they've been careful. Every time we got close, they shut down operations and moved. That man in the truck? We believe he was a key witness in an ongoing federal investigation, one that could bring down the people running this operation." I let that sink in. "So," I said slowly, "the HOA kidnapped him, and they hid him in a semi-truck parked in my driveway." "Exactly," Miller confirmed. "They needed a delay, a distraction. They knew we'd eventually come knocking, but they figured by the time we did, he'd be gone." A chill ran down my spine. "Gone? As in?" Miller's jaw tightened. "Dead." I exhaled, my hands shaking. "So what happens now?" Miller glanced at me. "Now? You're in the middle of this, whether you like it or not. That makes you a target." I swallowed hard. "Fantastic." I turned to look out the window as the SUV sped through town. I should have been terrified, but more than anything, I was angry. The HOA had been harassing me for months. I thought it was about grass height and trash cans, but the whole time they were covering up something much darker. And now I was in their crosshairs. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Miller's phone buzzed. He picked it up, listening for a moment. Then his expression darkened. "They just put a hit out on you," he said. My stomach dropped. "Wait, what?" Miller hit the gas, and the SUV lurched forward, speeding down the road. "They think you know too much," he said. "They want you dead." I barely had time to process that before, out of nowhere, boom, the SUV was hit. The impact sent us spinning off the road. Everything blurred together. Screeching tires, flashing lights, the sickening sound of metal crunching against metal. My head slammed against the door. Pain exploded behind my eyes. Then silence. Smoke filled the air. The SUV had landed on its side. I groaned, trying to push myself up, but my whole body ached. Miller was already moving. "Get out," he ordered, shoving at the broken windshield. I crawled after him, my heart racing. We barely made it out before I heard gunshots. "Run," Miller shouted. I didn't hesitate. We took off through the trees, the sounds of bullets whizzing past us. My mind was still spinning. Just an hour ago, my biggest problem was an HOA fine. Now I was running for my life. I ran. Branches whipped against my face as I stumbled through the dense trees, my breath ragged, my heart pounding like a war drum. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air behind me. Miller was right beside me, moving fast, his hand gripping his gun. "Keep going," he ordered. "They won't stop until you're dead." I didn't need convincing. Whoever these people were, they had just rammed an FBI vehicle off the road in broad daylight. That meant they weren't afraid of getting caught, which also meant they didn't plan to leave witnesses. I pushed forward, my legs screaming in protest. My mind was spinning. How did my life turn into this? A week ago, my biggest problem was fighting a bogus fine from the HOA. Now, I was running through the woods, dodging bullets from hitmen hired by my neighborhood's homeowners association. It sounded insane, but this was real. Another shot rang out, hitting a tree just inches from my head. Bark exploded into my face. I dived behind a thick tree trunk, gasping for breath. Miller crouched beside me, cursing under his breath. "They've got at least 2 shooters," he said. "Possibly more." I peeked around the tree and caught a glimpse of movement in the distance. 2 men in dark clothes, moving through the trees like hunters tracking prey. I clenched my fists. I was the prey. Miller grabbed my arm. "We need to move, now." I didn't argue. We darted deeper into the woods, moving as fast and quiet as we could. The gunfire had stopped, but I knew that wasn't a good thing. That meant they were flanking us. Miller was scanning the area ahead, eyes sharp. There should be a clearing soon, if we can make it to a road. A branch snapped. I froze. Miller turned sharply. "Go. Now." I spun, running full speed toward the clearing. Then, out of nowhere, a figure stepped out in front of me. A third shooter. He was already raising his gun. I had nowhere to go. Time slowed. I saw his finger squeeze the trigger. Then bang. The shooter collapsed. I gasped, staring in shock as Miller lowered his smoking gun. "Keep moving," he barked. I snapped out of it, jumping over the body and sprinting forward. My muscles screamed, my lungs burned, but somehow I kept going. Then, finally, I saw it. A road. An old, cracked highway cutting through the forest. It wasn't much, but it was salvation. Miller and I burst from the trees, stumbling onto the pavement. For a moment, all I could do was bend over, hands on my knees, trying to breathe. "We need a car," Miller said, scanning the road. I was about to ask what we'd do if one didn't come. Then I saw it. A vehicle coming toward us fast. A black sedan. Something about it made my stomach twist. Miller saw it too. "Get back," he shouted. Tires screeched. The car came to a sudden stop just a few feet away. The doors flew open, and out stepped 3 men in suits. Not just any men. I recognized one of them immediately. Mark Luton, the HOA president. The man who had been harassing me for months. He smiled. Well, Mr. Lawson," he said smoothly. "You've been quite the troublemaker, haven't you?" I felt my stomach drop. The head of the corrupt HOA had just tracked me down, and he wasn't alone. Miller raised his gun. Luton laughed. "You really think we came unprepared?" he said. More cars appeared behind him. One by one, black SUVs pulled up, blocking the road in both directions. We were trapped. Luton took a step closer, hands in his pockets. "I have to admit," he said, tilting his head, "we didn't expect you to figure it all out so fast." I clenched my fists. "Figure what out?" His smirk widened. "The HOA was never about rules, Mr. Lawson. It was about control. Money, power, leverage. And now, you've put yourself in the middle of something much bigger than you can handle." I swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" Luton sighed, almost sadly. "Now." He snapped his fingers. The men beside him raised their guns. "Now you die." Bang! A shot rang out, but it wasn't aimed at me. One of Luton's men collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. More gunfire erupted. From the trees, figures in tactical gear emerged, FBI agents. I ducked as bullets flew over my head. Miller grabbed my arm. "Stay down." The fight had begun. The FBI had been watching. And now, the war with the HOA had officially started. Gunfire erupted all around me. The road had turned into a war zone. Bullets flying, tires screeching, men shouting. I hit the ground, covering my head, my heart slamming against my ribs. Miller was beside me, returning fire, his movements quick and precise. The HOA's men weren't just neighborhood enforcers anymore. These were trained killers, and they were shooting to kill. I saw Luton dive behind a black SUV, barking orders to his men. The smug, arrogant man who had threatened me seconds ago was now panicking. The FBI agents had caught them off guard. I crawled toward cover, sliding behind an abandoned road sign as bullets pinged off the asphalt. "Lawson," Miller's voice rang out. I turned just in time to see him toss me something, a gun. I barely caught it, my hands shaking. "Can you shoot?" Miller yelled over the chaos. I had been to a shooting range once. Years ago. But now I was in a gunfight with the HOA. This was insane. But I knew one thing. If I didn't fight, I was dead. I gripped the gun tightly and took a deep breath. Then I peeked around the sign and fired. The shot went wide, missing the man I was aiming at. But it was enough to make him duck. Miller was already moving, using the distraction to take out another one of Luton's men. The fight was shifting. The FBI had come in strong, and the HOA's men were losing ground. Luton must have realized it too, because I saw him shouting into a phone. And then I heard it. A loud roar in the distance. Engines. Lots of them. I turned just in time to see another convoy of black SUVs speeding toward us. Reinforcements. Luton had called for backup. Miller saw it too. "Fall back," he shouted. The FBI agents began pulling back, moving toward the woods. They were outnumbered now. If they stayed, they'd be wiped out. I felt a hand on my shoulder. "We're leaving," Miller barked. "But Luton, we'll get him later," he snapped. "Right now, we need to keep you alive." I knew he was right. We turned and ran back toward the trees, just as the new SUVs skidded onto the scene. I risked one last look behind me and saw Luton watching us, a cold smile on his face. He wasn't scared anymore. He knew this wasn't over. And worst of all, so did I. 15 minutes later, we were back in the woods, moving fast. The sound of gunfire had faded, but I knew it wouldn't be long before Luton's men came after us. "Where are we going?" I panted. Miller glanced at me. "Somewhere safe." I wasn't convinced. I didn't know who to trust anymore. But right now, Miller was my only chance of surviving this nightmare. We moved deeper into the forest, my mind racing. The HOA had an army. They had money, power, and killers on their payroll. And worst of all, they wanted me dead. I exhaled sharply. This wasn't just about homeowner fines anymore. This was war. And somehow, I was right in the middle of it. We ran through the forest, my lungs burning, my mind racing. Every step felt like a countdown to when Luton's men would come crashing through the trees after us. Miller wasn't slowing down. He moved like a man who had done this before, dodging branches, stepping carefully over fallen logs, listening for sound behind us. I wasn't so graceful. My foot slammed into a root, and I stumbled forward, hitting the ground hard. Miller grabbed my arm, yanking me up. "No time for that," he growled. I swallowed my pain and kept moving. For what felt like an eternity, we ran. The road, the gunfight, the black SUVs, all of it faded behind us. But I knew that didn't mean we were safe. The HOA wasn't giving up. They put a hit on me. And the people who had just arrived at the shootout weren't going to stop until they had my body in a ditch. Finally, Miller slowed down. We had reached a steep slope, leading to a rocky creek bed below. He turned to me, his eyes sharp. "You good?" I could barely breathe. "Not really." "Too bad. We're climbing down." I looked over the edge. "That's a long way down. Better than getting shot in the back," he said, already lowering himself onto the slope. I gritted my teeth and followed. The ground was loose, the rocks shifting under my hands as I scrambled down. Halfway down, I heard something in the distance. A low, rumbling noise. Engines. I froze. Miller heard it too. He cursed under his breath. They found us. I turned my head, peering up through the trees. Sure enough, through the gaps in the branches, I saw black SUVs pulling up to the road above us. Doors slammed. Voices shouted. They were already looking. "Go!" Miller hissed. We rushed down the last few feet of the slope, landing in the creek bed. Water splashed around my ankles as I struggled to keep my balance. Miller scanned the area. "We need to get to the safe house." "Safe house?" I repeated. "You have a safe house." Miller was already moving. "You think we weren't prepared for something like this?" I didn't argue. I just followed. The creek bed stretched on, winding through the forest. We stuck to the rocky edges, staying low, moving fast. Behind us, voices echoed through the trees. "They went down here." I clenched my jaw. They were tracking us. Miller picked up the pace. The deeper we went, the denser the trees became. We were heading into the heart of the forest, far away from roads, houses, everything. And then, finally, I saw it. A small cabin, hidden beneath the trees. Miller rushed ahead, pulling out a set of keys. Inside. Now. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran up the steps, and the second I was through the door, Miller slammed it shut and locked it. I bent over, gasping for air. "We can't stay here long," Miller said, moving quickly. He grabbed a rifle from a rack near the door, checked the ammo, then peered through the window. "What is this place?" I asked, still catching my breath. "Safe house. FBI has a few set up near major operations." He didn't take his eyes off the window. "We have a chance to regroup here, but they'll find it eventually." I swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Miller turned to me, his expression dead serious. We take the fight to them. I stared at him. Take the fight to the HOA? Miller nodded. I laughed. A sharp panic sound. You do realize they have an army, right? SUVs, guns, hitmen. And we have the FBI, Miller interrupted. I frowned. Then why aren't they stopping them? Miller hesitated. Then, finally, he said, because someone high up is protecting them. I froze. I had suspected the HOA had connections, but this? You mean someone in the FBI is involved? I whispered. Miller's jaw tightened. I don't know how deep it goes, but I do know this. We can't trust anyone except my team. I rubbed my hands down my face. This was getting worse by the second. So what's the plan? I asked. Miller didn't answer right away. He turned back to the window, scanning the trees. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. I blinked. What's that? Proof. I straightened. Proof of what? Miller set the drive down on the table. Everything. The HOA's money laundering. Their connection to organized crime. Their involvement in human trafficking. My chest tightened. This was it. The evidence to take them down. I reached for it, but Miller slammed his hand over mine. Not yet, he warned. I frowned. Why not? Miller's eyes were dead serious. Because the second we use this, they'll throw everything they have at us. A chill ran down my spine. This won't be a game anymore, Lawson, he said. No more HOA fines. No more intimidation. The moment we expose them. I swallowed. They'll come to kill us. Miller nodded. Silence stretched between us. Then, I exhaled and nodded. Then let's make sure we hit them first. Miller smirked. Now you're talking. But before we could plan, before we could even think. Crack. A noise outside. I froze. Miller was already moving, gun raised. He signaled for me to stay put as he crept toward the window. I held my breath. He peered out. His body tensed. What is it? I whispered. Miller turned back to me, his face grim. They found us. Boom. The front door exploded inward. The door exploded inward, sending shards of wood and metal flying across the cabin. I hit the floor instinctively, covering my head as dust and debris filled the air. Miller lunged back, dodging the blast just in time. The second the smoke cleared, gunfire erupted. I could barely think. Everything happened so fast. Figures rushed in through the shattered doorway, weapons raised, their eyes cold and calculated. They weren't random thugs. They were professionals. HOA kill squads. Miller was already firing back, his movements precise, practiced. He dropped the first two men before they even had a chance to react. But more were pouring in. I scrambled back, my hands fumbling for the gun Miller had given me earlier. My fingers wrapped around the grip, slick with sweat. Then I saw him. Luton. He stepped in behind the chaos, calm, smiling. He wasn't holding a gun. He didn't need to. His men were already closing in. Miller reloaded and grabbed my arm. Move. I didn't hesitate. We raced for the back of the cabin, dodging bullets as they tore through the walls. Where do we go? I shouted. Basement, Miller growled. Now. I didn't ask questions. I sprinted behind him as he kicked open a hatch in the floor. We dropped down, landing hard on the concrete below. Miller grabbed a metal latch and slammed it shut, just as more bullets ripped through the floor above us. Dust rained down. My heart was hammering so loud I could barely think. I turned to Miller. Now, what? He pulled out his phone and typed something fast. Then he looked up. Now we call on the real cavalry. The basement was dark and cold, lined with old storage boxes and gun racks. I could hear footsteps above us, men moving through the cabin. They were searching, hunting. Luton's voice drifted through the cracks. You can't hide forever, Lawson. I gritted my teeth. Miller didn't respond. He just kept his gun aimed at the hatch. I could hear the quiet beeping of his phone. A coded message being sent. Who are you calling? I whispered. He didn't answer. Then, suddenly, bang. A bullet tore through the floor, missing my head by inches. They know we're down here. I hissed. Miller clenched his jaw. Then we hold them off. But before we could react, boom, something heavy landed on the roof of the cabin. The gunfire above suddenly stopped. Then, over the static of a radio, I heard a voice. This is the FBI. Drop your weapons and stand down. Now. My eyes widened. Miller grinned. I told you, he said. We weren't alone. The next 30 seconds were chaos. Flashbangs went off upstairs. Gunfire erupted, but this time it wasn't directed at us. Luton's men started shouting. Then, more explosions. The floor above shook. Miller grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back wall of the basement. He pressed a hidden panel, and a steel door slid open. I blinked. What? Escape tunnel, Miller said. Move. We ducked inside, just as more gunfire erupted above. The tunnel was narrow and dark, leading into the unknown. But at that moment, I didn't care. We ran. Behind us, I could hear the final screams of Luton's men. The FBI had arrived. But I knew deep down, this wasn't over. The tunnel opened up into the woods. The night air hit me like a slap. Miller led the way, moving fast. I struggled to keep up. My legs felt like jelly, my lungs burning. But then I heard it. Helicopters. I turned and saw them, FBI tactical choppers circling the area. I exhaled. We made it. Miller shook his head. Not yet. I frowned. What do you mean? Miller stopped walking. He turned to me, his face serious. Luton's not dead. I felt my stomach drop. He was right. Luton had been inside the cabin when the FBI arrived. But I hadn't heard his voice since. I hadn't seen his body. I looked back at the burning remains of the cabin. The flashing red and blue lights. The wreckage of SUVs and the bodies of his men. But no Luton. Miller's face was grim. This isn't over, Lawson, he said. I swallowed hard. I knew he was right. Luton had escaped. And if he was still alive, he would be coming for me. We stood there, breathing hard, watching the smoldering remains of the cabin in the distance. The helicopters circled, their searchlights sweeping over the forest. FBI agents moved through the wreckage, securing bodies, weapons, and the last few surviving HOA enforcers. But Luton was gone. Miller clenched his jaw. Damn it, he muttered. We should have had him. I swallowed. Miller didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the tree line, his body tense. Luton doesn't run unless he has somewhere safe to go. The words chilled me. Somewhere safe. Which meant this wasn't the end. The HOA wasn't just some local group of power-hungry Karens handing out citations. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. And Luton? He was the head of the snake. Miller turned back to me, his expression serious. Come on, he said. We need to get you somewhere secure. I hesitated. What about you? You're just going to let him go? Miller's jaw tightened. No, but if we don't move now, we won't get another chance to stop him. Something about his voice sent a chill down my spine. I followed Miller through the woods, away from the wreckage, away from the flashing lights of the FBI. But a question burned in my mind. Where did Luton go? An hour later, we were in a new safe house, an old, rundown motel off the highway. The kind of place no one asks questions. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands gripping the mattress, still trying to process everything. A week ago, I was fighting a bogus HOA fine. Now I was hiding from a criminal organization that had put a hit on me. This wasn't just corruption anymore. This was a war. Miller sat across from me, his phone in his hands. He had been making calls, quietly, his face unreadable. Then he looked up. We have a lead. I tensed. Luton. Miller nodded. Yeah, we think he went to one of his offshore properties. He has a network of safe houses, places where he can disappear when things get too hot. I exhaled. So what do we do? Miller's eyes darkened. We go after him. It took less than 24 hours to set up the mission. Miller's FBI team had tracked Luton's movements to a private estate on the Gulf Coast. A secluded mansion, surrounded by armed guards, high walls, and private security. It wasn't just a safe house. It was a fortress. We stood in a dimly lit briefing room, staring at the blueprints laid out across the table. Miller's team, 5 other agents, were geared up, weapons ready. I fell out of place. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't FBI. I was just a guy who wanted to live by a lake. But now I was in the middle of a raid on an international criminal's mansion. Miller pointed at the blueprint. Luton is here, in the main building. He has at least 10 guards, possibly more. We go in fast, take him alive. Why alive? I asked. Miller gave me a sharp look. Because we need him to talk. I swallowed. Right. We needed evidence. If we just killed him, the rest of the HOA's operation would go underground. No. We had to end this for good. Miller turned to me. You sure you want to do this? I hesitated. Did I? I had barely survived the last shootout. But if I ran now, what was the point? Luton would keep coming for me. The HOA wouldn't stop until I was dead. I clenched my fists. I'm in. Miller nodded. Then let's move. 3 hours later, we were outside Luton's estate. The Gulf Coast wind was thick with salt, the moon high above us, casting long shadows across the property. I crouched behind an SUV, my heart pounding. Miller and his team were ready. The plan was simple. Breach. Clear. Capture. No mistakes. No second chances. Miller raised his hand. Go. And then, all hell broke loose. The first explosion took out the front gate. The second blasted the mansion's power. Gunfire erupted as Miller's team stormed in, moving like ghosts through the darkness. I stuck close to Miller, my gun shaking in my hands. I wasn't trained for this, but I knew one thing. I wanted Luton to pay. We moved through the corridors, clearing rooms, stepping over unconscious guards. Then, we reached the top floor, a massive office, and inside, Luton. He stood by a massive glass window, staring out at the chaos. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't scared. He turned to us, smiling. Well, he said, took you long enough. Miller aimed his gun. Hands up, Luton. It's over. Luton laughed. You really think so? My stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. Then, Luton tapped his wristwatch. The timer started counting down. 0:10, 0:09, 0:08. Miller's eyes widened. Bomb! Everything went white. The explosion ripped through the mansion like a thunderclap, shattering windows, collapsing walls, and sending a shockwave of fire and debris through the air. I felt myself lift off the ground, weightless for a moment, then slammed into something hard. Pain exploded through my ribs. My ears rang violently, drowning out everything. The world was spinning. Smoke, heat, chaos. I groaned, forcing my eyes open. Everything was blurred and broken. The room we had just been in? Gone. Flames licked at the walls. The roof had caved in on one side, chunks of stone and steel blocking the exits. I blinked through the haze, trying to piece together what just happened. Luton, the bomb. Miller's voice snapped me back to reality. Lawson. I turned, coughing, my throat raw from the smoke. Miller was a few feet away, struggling to push a slab of debris off his legs. His face was bloody, his tactical vest torn. We have to move, he growled. I staggered to my feet, every part of my body screaming in pain. The mansion was coming down around us. Luton, I choked out. Miller's expression darkened. Gone. I turned toward where he had been standing, but there was nothing left. Just a smoking crater where his office had been. The windows were blown out, revealing the night sky and the ocean stretching into the distance. Luton had escaped. Again, rage boiled in my chest. How'd he keep slipping away? Miller finally shoved the debris off his legs, gritting his teeth. We need to get out before the whole place collapses. I helped him up, and we stumbled through the ruins of the hallway, smoke choking the air. Every step felt like walking through hell. Gunfire cracked outside. The rest of Miller's team was still fighting. We pushed forward, dodging falling beams and shattered furniture. My legs were heavy, but I didn't stop. Then, as we rounded a corner, I saw it. An elevator shaft, doors blown open. I skidded to a stop, staring down. The cables were cut, the bottom far below. Miller panted beside me. No way down, he muttered. Then we heard it. Footsteps, coming from behind us. I turned, my heart seizing in my chest. Luton's men, at least 4 of them, stepping over the wreckage, guns raised. They had been waiting. One of them smirked. End of the line. I tightened my grip on my gun. Miller was already moving. Down, he shouted, shoving me. I stumbled, my foot slipping, and suddenly I was falling. The world blurred into darkness as I plummeted through the elevator shaft. I barely had time to think before. Crash. Pain shot through my back as I landed hard on a metal platform halfway down. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs. I gasped, eyes wide with shock. I should have died, but by some miracle, I had landed on a service ledge built into the shaft for maintenance. Above me, I heard gunfire erupt. Miller was still fighting. I gritted my teeth and pushed myself up, every muscle screaming. I had to get back up there. But then a sound. A door creaking open nearby. I turned my head, my pulse spiking. Through the dim emergency lights, I saw it. An exit. An old service hatch, leading to an underground passage. My breath caught. Luton's escape route. This was how he had gotten out. And now, I had a chance to catch him. I didn't hesitate. I stumbled toward the hatch, pulling it open, revealing a dark tunnel leading underground. The air was damp, cold. I had no idea where it went. But I knew one thing. Luton was down there. And this time, I wasn't letting him go. The air in the tunnel was thick with mildew and dust. The walls, damp and covered in shadows, felt like they were closing in on me as I made my way forward. Each step echoed in the eerie silence, the only sound my own breath, coming in ragged gasps. I was still dazed from the explosion, my head throbbing with every movement. My body ached, but I kept moving. There was no time to stop now. Luton had gotten away once. He wouldn't get the chance to do it again. I reached for my gun, fingers still trembling from the adrenaline. It felt heavier than ever, as though the weight of this mission was pressing down on me. I was in the belly of the beast now, the heart of Luton's underground operations. This wasn't just some safe house or retreat. It was where it all came together. The money laundering, the human trafficking, the corruption, all of it funneled through the HOA and into the depths of places like this. I swallowed hard, pushing down the nausea that rose in my throat. I had already seen too much. I had almost died twice today, but I wasn't going to let Luton slip away again. The tunnel stretched ahead, winding deeper into the ground. There were no signs, no clues to tell me where it led, but I trusted my gut. I could feel him. He was down here. I had no idea how long I had been walking when I came across the first door. It was old, rusted, and sealed shut, but there were fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. Luton's men. I reached for the door handle, tried to be as quiet as possible. A creak. I froze. Through the thin crack in the door, I could see a small room, lit dimly by flickering fluorescent lights. At least 4 men were standing inside, talking quietly. They hadn't noticed me yet. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to slow my breathing. I didn't have much time before they'd hear me. I quickly made my decision. I had to move fast. I kicked open the door, taking the first man down with a swift blow to the chest. The others barely had time to react. I fired 3 quick shots, taking out the next 2 before they could pull their weapons. The 4th man screamed as he tried to scramble for cover, but it was too late. I moved quickly, dragging them into the shadows so I wouldn't be seen. There was no time for hesitation. The room was small, cramped, and poorly lit, but I could see a desk in the corner. Papers were scattered everywhere, and on top of the desk, a laptop. My heart skipped a beat. This could be it, the evidence I needed. I snatched it up, my fingers trembling. I didn't care if it had tracking software or hidden passwords. I was in too deep now. If I could get this back to the FBI, this could bring down the entire operation. But as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. A safe. I hesitated. Could it be? I knew that I was running out of time. Every minute I spent down here meant more risk. But my gut told me that this was too important to skip. I quickly went to the safe, feeling the cold metal beneath my hands. The code was probably just a series of numbers, like a combination lock. I spun the dial, hoping for the best. Click. The safe opened with a slight turn of the knob. Inside, there was more than I expected: cash, documents, and, in the back, something I didn't expect. A flash drive. I grabbed it. This could be the key to everything. I didn't waste any more time. I slipped the drive into my jacket and began to leave. But as I turned toward the door, I heard footsteps approaching. I froze. It was him, Luton. The door creaked open behind me, and I spun just in time to see him standing there. A cold smile spread across his face as he looked me up and down. I have to admit, Lawson, he said, his voice smooth and calm. You've been more trouble than I thought. I didn't say anything. I raised my gun. You're not getting away this time. Luton laughed. Oh, I think you'll find I have many more places to run. But you, his eyes narrowed. You'll never leave here alive. I fired once, aiming for his chest, but he was already moving. He ducked behind the doorframe, and I heard the sound of multiple weapons being drawn from the shadows. I was outnumbered. and I was trapped. I took a step back, my gun still raised, my heart racing. Luton smirked. I've been waiting for this moment, Lawson, for you to think you've won. But you're my world now, and you're not going to walk out of here. I could hear the shuffling of feet, the growing sounds of his men surrounding me. I didn't have much time left. Then, just as they were about to close in on me, a loud bang rang out, followed by another. I turned just in time to see Miller and 2 FBI agents burst through the back door, guns raised, taking down 2 of Luton's men in a flash. "Get down," Miller shouted. I dropped to the floor as the room exploded in gunfire, bullets ricocheting off the walls, hitting the floor and ceiling. Luton's men were falling one by one, but Luton wasn't done. He was slipping away, moving toward an exit behind him. I jumped up, desperate. "No," I yelled, but it was too late. Luton was gone, vanishing into the dark tunnel behind the door. I turned to Miller, my heart pounding. "He's still out there." Miller's face was grim. "And now we know where he's headed. We're not letting him slip away again." We ran out of the room, following the sounds of footsteps echoing down the hall. We were going after him. No more running. This time it would end. We raced through the narrow tunnels, our footsteps echoing off the cold, concrete walls. The adrenaline was a numbing haze that drowned out the pain in my body. My mind was focused on one thing, getting Luton. Miller was ahead of me, his movements swift, every step calculated. His team flanked him, guns raised, their eyes sharp. The entire tunnel network seemed to be a maze, twisting and turning in every direction. But Miller knew the layout. I trusted him to lead us to the right place. I could hear the sound of footsteps ahead. Someone was moving fast. "We're getting close," Miller muttered, his voice low. "Stay sharp." I nodded, barely able to catch my breath. My hand still gripped my gun, but it felt heavier by the second. Then I heard it. A clink. A metal door, closing. "He's in there," I whispered. Miller stopped his tracks, motioning for everyone to spread out. We took position near the walls, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. He signaled to the rest of the team, giving a brief nod. We were about to burst through that door, no questions asked. The sound of the lock clicking was like a thunderclap in the silence. I felt my heart race faster, but there was no turning back. Miller raised his hand. 3, 2, 1, bang! The door exploded off its hinges, slamming into the wall. We rushed in, guns raised, scanning the room. But Luton wasn't there. The room was large and open, lined with filing cabinets and a massive desk in the center. The lights were dim, flickering erratically as though the place hadn't been properly maintained. But there was no Luton. I felt my stomach sink. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Miller's eyes darted around the room, his hand still gripping his gun. "He has to be close," he muttered. "Check everything. Quick." The team began to search the room, rifles sweeping over the furniture, checking the cabinets under the desk. I moved toward the desk, my eyes scanning the surface. Papers, files scattered everywhere. It was a setup. Then, a click, the sound of a trapdoor opening beneath me. Before I could react, the floor beneath me gave way, and I was plummeting downward. I landed with a hard thud, the wind knocked out of me. For a moment, everything was blurry. I could barely hear anything except the ringing in my ears. My chest burned as I struggled to breathe, my back aching. Then, I realized something. I wasn't alone. Luton. He was standing in front of me, a smirk playing across his face. I scrambled to my feet, reaching for my gun, but it was no use. He was faster. "You should have stayed out of this, Lawson," he said, his voice cool and calm. "You could have gone home, could have lived your life. But now," he stepped closer, "now you've become part of the problem." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't the end. Not yet. I wasn't going to let him get away. "You're done, Luton," I spat, pulling myself into a defensive stance. "The FBI's on their way. Your empire's over." Luton chuckled, the sound of it sending a cold shiver down my spine. "You really think they can stop this? You really think the FBI can bring me down?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a small device, his fingers brushing over it carefully. A detonator. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I've made my arrangements." "Lawson," Luton said with a smile. "If I can't have control, Nobody can. Suddenly, the air felt thick. I could feel the tension in my muscles, every instinct screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. His finger hovered over the button. I raised my gun, aiming directly at him. "Don't do it, Luton," I warned, my voice shaking but firm. For a moment, there was a long silence. And then, the sound of footsteps. I whipped my head around, and there they were, Miller and his team, coming down the same path I had fallen through. They weren't far behind. Luton's eyes narrowed as he looked over my shoulder, his finger twitching over the button. "You're too late," he snarled. "This place is going down." Without thinking, I lunged. I tackled him, pushing his hand away from the detonator. The force of my move sent us both crashing to the ground. The detonator slipped from his hand and skidded across the floor. Miller and the team were right behind us. "Freeze!" Miller shouted, his gun aimed at Luton's head. Luton glared, but there was no escape. The jig was up. "You're finished, Luton," I panted, pinning him to the floor. "Give it up." He glared up at me, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You think this is the end?" I nodded, keeping my gun on him. "It is." Luton's hands were bound, and his smug smile was gone. He was dragged out of the room by the FBI team, taken away to face whatever justice awaited him. But as I watched him being led away, a cold feeling lingered in the pit of my stomach. The battle was over. For now. But I knew that this wasn't the end. There were others. And Luton, even behind bars, still had connections. I felt the weight of it all. The fight against corruption was far from finished. But as Miller stepped up beside me, looking at the scene, he nodded. "We got him. This time it's done." I didn't respond immediately. I just nodded. We weren't done yet. The air felt different now. The weight of the last few days seemed to lift ever so slightly, but the reality was undeniable. Luton was arrested, his empire crumbling piece by piece. But the damage, the lives ruined, the corruption that had seeped into everything was still there. And I had no illusions about what this victory truly meant. The FBI agents moved quickly, securing the area, and Luton was loaded into a transport vehicle. His eyes were cold, his face twisted in defeat, but there was still that flicker of defiance in his gaze. He hadn't been broken, but he would be in time. Justice would catch up to him. Miller stood beside me, watching the scene unfold. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice tired but resolute. I nodded, but the words felt hollow. "Is it, though?" I asked, more to myself than to him. Miller glanced over at me, his expression unreadable. "It is. The hardest part is done. We took him down. Now, it's up to the courts to finish what we started." But I wasn't so sure. The whole time we had been chasing Luton, there had been a gnawing feeling at the back of my mind, one that told me this wasn't as simple as it seemed. This wasn't just one man pulling the strings. It was a network, a system of corruption too big for one person to control. Luton might be behind bars, but his influence was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I took a deep breath, pushing the thought aside for now. "I guess we'll see." Miller clapped me on the shoulder. "You did good, Lawson. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone who's been crushed under the weight of this system." He looked at the now empty space where Luton had been moments ago. And for all those people who thought no one was looking out for them, I couldn't help but smile faintly. Just another day in the life of a normal guy, trying to keep his grass trimmed, right? Miller chuckled, the sound light, but with an edge of something deeper in it. "Yeah, well, the world's never quite that simple, is it?" The weeks that followed were a blur. Luton's arrest and the evidence we had gathered were enough to crack open the whole operation. The FBI moved in swiftly, unraveling connections to money laundering, human trafficking, and organized crime that had been festering under the surface for years. The HOA, which had once seemed like a mild nuisance, was exposed for the monstrosity it had become. They were no longer just a group of angry neighbors. They were a part of something far more dangerous. News outlets picked up on the story, with headlines screaming about the federal takedown of an international crime ring disguised as an HOA. It seemed surreal, like something out of a movie. But this was real. The world was waking up to the fact that these seemingly harmless community groups were often fronts for something far worse. And, as much as it pained me to admit it, I couldn't help but feel a little bit of relief. I had helped bring it down, but there was a darker side to all of it, something I couldn't ignore. There were others involved, people still free, hiding behind layers of influence and power, people who had the resources to slip through the cracks. I knew, deep down, that even with Luton's capture, the battle was far from over. The corruption ran deeper than I could fathom. I didn't have time to focus on that, though. I had my own life to rebuild. It had been 2 months since the raid, and I was finally sitting on the deck of my house by the lake. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water. The peacefulness felt almost foreign after the chaos of the past few weeks. But as I looked out at the horizon, I knew this was a moment I'd fought for. A moment of peace. The HOA had been disbanded, the corrupt officials arrested, and the community began to rebuild itself. I had no more fines to worry about, no more letters threatening my mailbox or my lawn. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, even though I knew the scars would stay with me. Miller had moved on to another case. He'd offered to bring me along, to help out with other investigations, but I declined. I'd done my part. I was ready to move forward. I picked up my fishing rod and cast it out into the water, the ripples spreading across the lake. There was something oddly therapeutic about the simplicity of it. No more conspiracies, no more hiding in tunnels or shooting my way through chaos. Just the sound of the water, the wind, and the occasional fish tugging on the line. I felt like I had won back my life. But I knew, deep down, that there were still pieces to the puzzle. Pieces I hadn't found yet. That night, as I was winding down, a knock came at my door. I opened it to find a familiar face, Miller. He was smiling slightly, but his eyes were serious. "Got a minute?" he asked. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "What's up?" Miller glanced around, as though checking to see if anyone was listening. He stepped inside, his eyes hardening. "Listen, Lawson," he began. "The people we've taken down, Luton was just a small part of something bigger. We got some intel that suggests this operation is connected to several powerful people we haven't even scratched the surface of yet." I froze. "You mean?" "Yeah," Miller interrupted. "This isn't over, and we're going after them. All of them. But it's going to take time." I looked out the window at the still waters of the lake, the quiet stretching on like the calm before a storm. It felt like everything had been leading to this moment. "Do you want in?" Miller asked. I thought about it for a moment. The quiet life I'd longed for, the peace I'd finally found, now seemed like a distant memory. I could walk away. I could leave it all behind. But as I thought about the people who were still suffering, the lives still being destroyed, I knew what my answer would be. I took a deep breath. "Yeah, I'm in." The fight was far from over, but now, at least, I knew where I stood. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who couldn't. And this time, I wouldn't stop until it was done.